Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another NetHope Solutions Center webinar. Today, our topic is using satellite imagery and AI in humanitarian contexts. And we are welcoming presenters from Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team. And before we get started today, I'd like to just go over a few housekeeping guidelines for the session. We'd like to keep the session interactive. Please post your questions in the Zoom chat window for our Q&A session toward the end of the hour today. Also, look for a follow-up email later today with a link to the recording for this session that you may share broadly if you like, and any other links and collateral and materials and information from today's session. Also, we value your feedback. We would appreciate it if you would complete our webinar satisfaction poll that will be presented toward the end of the webinar as well. And with that, I would like to hand it off to my colleague, Layla Toplik, Head of Emerging Technologies Initiative at NetHope.
Thank you, Madeline. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Madeline, if we go to the next slide. This webinar is brought to you by NetHope's AI Working Group. That's part of the Emerging Technologies Initiative. And this working group is focused on accelerating impactful and responsible adoption of AI and machine learning in the nonprofit sector. All NetHope members are welcome to join the working group, and Seth will be sharing the link in the chat window. And our next monthly meeting is scheduled for April 8th, so a couple of weeks from now. Next slide, please. Now, before we go into the topic that we have planned for you today, I wanted to give you an update on one resource that we talked about in our December webinar that's been published and made available more broadly since then, and that is our AI Ethics for Nonprofits toolkit. This toolkit was developed by NetHope's AI Working Group in collaboration with USAID and MIT D-Lab. And the toolkit is meant to bridge the gap that we've seen in the sector between having ethical principles and actually knowing how to apply them, how to design and use AI in the nonprofit sector in a responsible way. And this first installment of the toolkit is available in a workshop format, so you can host conversations and trainings in your organizations and in your communities, and it will help you learn the fundamentals of AI ethics, and also practice how to apply ethical considerations related specifically to the principle of fairness. So how do you optimize for fairness and mitigate the risk of bias? And how do you do that in a context of several nonprofit use cases? So as you start using this toolkit, what we'd love to hear from you is ideas for any future installments, and then also any feedback you might have. And you're welcome to email me your ideas and suggestions. And I believe Seth will probably share my email in the chat window. Next slide, please. Now, to frame today's discussion, I want to give you some context on why we're talking about satellite imagery and AI. First, as many of you know, there is a growing number of emergencies, protracted crisis, and inequalities around the world. And since I like data, I'll use a couple of data points to paint a picture of what we're dealing with. Between 2000 and 2019, there were over 7,000 major natural disasters that claimed over 1.2 million lives and affected over 4 billion additional people. And today, that close to 80 million people are displaced due to conflicts and persecution, and as many as 143 million people could soon be displaced due to the climate change. At the same time, inequalities are growing sharply across multiple dimensions, including education and economic opportunity. So these are just some of the humanitarian challenges that we're facing. At the same time, rapid advancements in technology, which we'll be talking about today, are making more things possible, including a greater reach and also a faster and more targeted response. And among the most promising innovations for the humanitarian sector are at the intersection of satellite imagery and AI. And specific to satellite imagery, there have been rapid advances in the availability of the imagery. Every day, millions of images are captured from the space by a growing number of satellites. And in the humanitarian context, these images are really key to supporting critical operations on the ground. In parallel, as you'll see today, there have been massive advances in artificial intelligence capabilities, which really is critical for transforming the imagery into actionable information. And the use cases range from helping with rescue operations after natural disasters, to monitoring population displacement, settlement mapping, identifying illegal deforestation, and many others. Now, while there are some examples of practical implementations of using satellite imagery and AI capabilities, and we've been talking about some of them in our AI working group, what we know is that there is actually a growing gap between what is possible and what is actually being used and implemented in the sector today. And for a number of reasons, I'll mention three. One is NGOs are struggling to navigate the rapidly changing technology landscape. Some are not aware of what is possible using this rich information that machine learning can derive from satellite imagery, and also how that connects to their core missions of supporting communities in need. And there's also lack of common approaches to ethical design and use and cross-sector partnerships. So what we wanted to do today is really extend the conversation that we've been having within our AI working group and explore some of these topics around technology, ethics, partnerships, and do that in a context of a sector-specific example from the team at HOT. So if we go to the next slide, we first actually want to hear from you. So Madeline will launch a poll so we can understand who's here with us. If you're already using satellite imagery and AI in humanitarian or other contexts, maybe conservation. If you are, please share those use cases in a chat window so we can all learn from you. If you might be in a process of evaluating what might be some of the viable use cases or tools or resources, if you're just starting to learn about what's possible or other. And again, use the chat window to give us some more context. So let's see the results of the poll. So majority of you are either just starting to learn about what's possible or evaluating viable use cases, tools, and resources. I'm really pleased to hear that, because we've designed today's webinar to really give you the sense for what might be possible, and also how to plan ahead to set up a project that is both impactful, responsible, and also sustainable. So thank you again for your input. And if we go to the next slide, I would like to take this time to introduce to you two speakers today. Bo Percival, Director of Technology Innovation at Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team. Bo will provide a brief introduction to AI-assisted community mapping and really speak to the work that HOT is doing globally. And then Dinar Adiatma, Facebook project associate at HOT Indonesia, will talk about a specific use case in Indonesia, how the team is using AI-assisted mapping in partnership with Facebook to enhance the speed and the quality of data being added to the map. I want to just make a note that Dinar is joining us from Jakarta. It's already past 10 o'clock at night his time. It's pouring rain, so you might hear some noise in the background. But we thought, and also his team thought it was really important to have the opportunity to share with all of you what they're learning on the ground. So thank you, Dinar, and thank you, Bo, for joining us today. And over to you, Bo.
Thanks very much, Layla. Before I do the full launch, I'm just going to double check that you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thanks, Layla. Thanks for the introduction, and appreciate, as always, being a part of these webinar sessions and the work that NetHope is doing on emerging technologies. I've had the luxury or fortune of being able to be involved in these from 2 different organizations, so I really think that regardless of which angle you're coming from, that this is always a great place to kind of to keep a theme and a thread going for the organization that you're working with. And the emerging tech group definitely spans across different organizations and the work that everybody's doing. And I really personally get a lot of value out of it, but I think the organizations that that I've worked for also get a lot of value out of it. So what Layla was talking about there, in terms of the AI for satellite imagery, there is as many use cases as you could probably imagine when it comes to using AI and satellite imagery and bringing those 2 things together. Some of the ones that Layla talked about are really the tip of the iceberg in terms of what can be done once we have the imagery, and we can get this snapshot of what the world looks like from a place that we don't normally sit, and it really gives us a new perspective. And when you combine that with AI, it allows you to amplify that new perspective. What I'm going to talk about a little bit today is just from an organizational level with HOT, and then I'm going to hand over to Dina to talk about the use case, because I think that's probably more interesting than hearing me talk. But what I wanted to talk a little bit about was who HOT is, if you haven't met us before, and also how we integrate AI into our workflow. For those that haven't come across OpenStreetMap before, that's probably the best place to start. OpenStreetMap is a crowd-sourced, free and open map of the world. What this basically gives everybody is the ability to contribute and the ability to participate in creating a digital map of the world. And this means that more people are counted, and because it's community-led, it's not kind of controlled by a particular player saying this is how we think the world should look. It's actually more in terms of like community saying this is how the world looks to us. The other way I like to describe it in much more snappy is like if you took Wikipedia and Google and they had a baby that was then raised by the crowd or by the village, this is how OpenStreetMap looks quite often. And so who's HOT? Basically, HOT is an organization that started around in response to the Haiti disaster. We've been operating now for a bit over 10 years. Actually, last year was our 10-year anniversary. And we've always been contributing to OpenStreetMap and using it for humanitarian and development purposes. So we recently received some support from the Audacious project. And this really set us on our new vision of making sure that as many people can be counted and contribute to that open map as possible. And this is kind of summed up in the supporting a movement to map an area home to 1 billion people. The problem that we have really is that is a very big vision that we're working towards. And being able to do that takes a lot of work. And what we also recognize is much of the work that goes into OpenStreetMap, and particularly from our work with Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, is volunteer-based. And this is people who are already over capacity. This is people who might be doing 10 other things. And so we kind of started or were based around this idea of like open source software, free software, get in there, make your contribution, and build the map. As we grow, what we really want to do is recognize that these efforts can be amplified. And this is why AI is like particularly important to us, is not to replace people, but to amplify the efforts that they're putting towards what we're doing. What is possible? I'm going to leave most of that to an introduction from Dina about what they're doing in Indonesia with the Facebook project. But what I would say is this is a really great starting point of what could be possible. One thing that when you think about AI and satellite imagery, the image recognition use case comes immediately to mind. But there's so many different ways that it could be used throughout any part of the process, whether it's just recognizing what is in that satellite imagery, all the way through to implementing and turning that into like data that someone can use to either respond to a disaster or can use to influence governments, etc. And then for us, the biggest challenge it's always easier in principle. I think that's something that I'm learning more and more as I work with AI, is that the theory of it is really great and really easy. And then you add the implementation and it becomes way more exciting and a lot more challenging. So really briefly, before I hand over to Dina, next slide, please, is I just want to kind of show the conceptual model for what we've been doing at HOT with AI assistance for mapping. So essentially, we run a model over the satellite imagery, and that model can identify where buildings and roads exist, possibly. And then we can determine if that's a building, if that's a road, and then we're able to import that into OpenStreetMap. So when I say import, this is not like taking people out of the process, and we definitely keep a human, like people in the loop, where the prediction is made, a mapper can validate that prediction, and then that data, once it's checked for quality, goes into the into OpenStreetMap. So I'm not going to talk too much more about that because I'll kind of be stealing Dina's thunder here. But with that, I think I will hand over to Dina to talk us through the Facebook use case in Indonesia.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. I'm sorry if you have a noise from my end because it's raining here. Yeah, today I will share the Indonesia use case for AI-assisted mapping. We have been mapping using AI data since 2018. First question we have, what problem am I trying to solve? Indonesia's road network map is still far from complete until the end of 2017. Many rural areas still have poor road connection. We want to complete a road network map that will open access to resource or basic amenities like emergency response, healthcare, local market, education, and utilities. You are counted when you are visible, at least on the map. Disconnected communities have less power when underrepresented to influence government policy, distribution of resources, support communities planning, also for disaster response. Why road network? It is simple because it is connecting people to fulfilling their needs. Next slide, please. How is the problem being addressed today? People coming to OpenStreetMap to complete the maps, mostly using editor tools named ID Editor and Java OpenStreetMap or JOSM, as you can see on the table. Most of them tracing manually from satellite imagery that available publicly for the OpenStreetMap community. Tracing manually means you need more time to draw a road, building, rivers, and any object in OSN. If you only map for the general tag or a remote mapper, it will be time consuming unless you have and add the ground detail information from survey or visit. The next question, why AI is better than hand mapping? So let's check this video demonstration.
Thanks, Dina. I'm just going to quickly talk over the top of this video while hopefully everyone can see it. So what we're seeing here is if you have a look at the bottom left, there's a sped up time lapse of what's going on. This is traditional mapping in OpenStreetMap. So someone would load the editor, the ID editor that Dina was just talking about, and then they would go about the job of connecting nodes and ways. The nodes are little dots, ways are the things that connect the dots to each other. So we can see the satellite imagery here, and this is someone moving around the screen, identifying, yes, that's a road, adding all in the nodes, and then connecting those. The timer that you're seeing run out here is actually like very fast. Normally, beginner mapper particularly would take a bit more time. Now with the AI assisted editor, which is known as Rapid, what you see now is pink predictions from the model that is making a suggestion or a prediction of where that road possibly is. This model is run over the top of the imagery, and then the user can just either validate that model by saying, yes, this is a road, or no, it's not, and then make slight edits, which you just saw there. If there is a node that's not connected to another one, then they can just connect those two. So what we see now is all of the predictions and the new data getting added immediately to OpenStreetMap, which means it can be accessed in a much quicker time than what it would be under traditional conditions. The thing will just finish off now. And what you may not have noticed, but we're going to see quite clearly in a second, is in traditional mapping, this task would have taken about 2 minutes. And using Rapid, it's about 45 seconds. So we really do see a significant impact on how mapping is done. And let me just say that that was done in 2 minutes, but a task normally would probably take someone up to 2 hours. So if you can think about that in terms of those kind of numbers, you see dramatic increase in both the quantity and quality of the data being added to the map. Dino, I'll pass back to you.
Thank you, Bo. Yeah. Based on video demonstration, mapping using AI will be faster than traditional mapping with the relatively same result. I mean, with basic tech and geometry. The idea is to increase both the quantity and quality of map data. New mappers can learn the process and contribute more data while learning to add OSM data. New mappers are guided by AI model output, improving skills and quality together. So new mappers will be aware of the data quality since start mapping in OSM. An experienced mapper can quickly validate AI model prediction to make sure validation also stay in the loop to maintain data quality. So next slide, please. What is the solution? For this case, AI data is helpful to complete a specific area faster. The result is relatively the same with manual hand mapping. In our context, we are using Facebook raw data that fully covers the Indonesia area. You can check on the right picture that we use for Indonesia mapping. But for use object provides indifferent coverage. In the left picture, not only the road, but also building and address for specific areas. Next slide, please. What kinds of the data does your solution need? First, satellite imagery for OSM reference data to train model from OSM database, and road ready-to-use dataset. Satellite imagery use is available publicly for the OpenStreetMap community from various providers like Bing, Maxar, Mapbox, and Esri. We are using Maxar Premium as the main imagery for both generated data and human verification. We use the ready-to-use dataset, which means AI data that's suitable for OpenStreetMap format and license. It always needs human verification before uploaded to the OpenStreetMap. For end user, it will just likely accept or deny the AI data to be added. Please check on the right picture for more detailed picture. All of this publicly available for OSM community via Rapid AI editor or Map with AI just some plugin. Next slide, please. What resource do I need to support the development, implementation, and maintenance of the solution? First, the technical sides come from Facebook as product owner and developer. My team at HOT alongside Facebook playing a role as data quality control and human validator. Non-technical sides including administration and community facilitator. The administration process on this project is documenting the data import workflow in Wiki OpenStreetMap. This is done by Facebook. And for community facilitator, my team support to improve the local community's experience using Rapid via training or Mapathon. Mapathon is an organized event for anyone mapping OSM at the same time and same target areas. Next slide. So let's talk about potential bias from AI in my context. First, data freshness. AI raw data is not generated every single second. It is generated at different dates, 71% in 2020 and the rest in 2019. But it will adjust automatically with existing OSM data to avoid overlapping. So far, I have estimated less than 10% case with tracing manually due to imagery condition. Second, and also always be our top priority, is the quality issue. The quality issue for this work could be data geometry that's not aligned well with Maxar imagery, mostly caused by cloudy areas or unclear imagery. Then we anticipate an invalid tag that comes from human error. All text added to OpenStreetMap should follow the rules that are documented well in Wiki OpenStreetMap. We have several internal tags and should be deleted automatically before uploading to OpenStreetMap. The last quality issue is suspicious human edits like mass deletion, added imaging roads, added an incomplete comment, and etc. And then third, incoming more organized mapping. Vietnam, where my team mapping now, after we mapping Indonesia and Malaysia, so we are mapping in Vietnam now, has more than 90% daily average for organized mapper. You can check the source, the link provided. It could be one-time mass voluntary like Mapathon, or time-to-time dedicated mappers as we did. This mapper typically remote mappers. Ideally, every remote mapper should follow the local consensus, if any, provided in Wiki OpenStreetMap to avoid inconsistency and misleading concept. Because the road classification concept varies from country to country, especially on the minor road classification. Then, next slide, please. After identifying our potential bias, I have approached to maintain them. First, we are teaming up with mappers and quality assurance for data validation. The mappers will validate AI data, then quality assurance will validate the mappers data. During the process, we are using quality assurance tools. This tool will provide either a list of bugs in the data or data visualization, which mappers can then go and fix using editing tools like ID editor, Rapid, or GOSM. The bugs are either automatically detected based on the rules and data analyzed, or the tools provide a means of manually reporting them, or some combination of two. And yeah, here are the top 3 tools we use at most. OSM Change Analyzer or OSM CHA, OSM History Viewer by Pewu, and Overpass Turbo. And also beside these 3 tools, we are using TechInfo, MapRoulette, Augmented Change Viewer or Achavi, and Joseph Validator. All of these tools publicly available for OSM community. So next slide, please. Yeah. Then we always are proactive to every feedback from the community. On the right is OpenStreetMap Change Set discussion. What is change set? Change set in OSM is a group of changes made by a single user over a short period. One change set may, for example, include the addition of new elements to OSM, the addition of new text, change to text values, deletion of text, also deletion of element. Every OpenStreetMap contributor can discuss specific editing in a specific change set. Each change set has a unique number. In this example, we leave a notification to the previous editor over our change in the left bottom. Then they give us detailed feedback to simplify our notes because we added so many. And since then, we have included their input as part of our workflow. So this is what I mean about we always concerned about every feedback from community. Therefore, I'm also monitoring some forums and subscribe to them via RSS feeder. You can see in the top picture. I want to gather any input and give them a response as soon as possible because always there is something new to learn from the community. And the last, how you can contribute and be involved. You can always be a sponsor to mapping a remote area or any specific area. You can perform training if you are expert, provide imagery access in this context for OpenStreetMap mapping, provide an OSM compatible license datasets if you have authority, and you are always welcome to share ideas with developer or OpenStreetMap. And in this picture, this is my team that trained by Facebook team in Jakarta to using map with AI. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dinar, and thank you, Bo. We will make these slides available to all of you via the same page that you used to sign up for this webinar. And now we're going to go into the Q&A. Before we do that, I mentioned in the chat window that in this and also many other presentations that we've done over the past 3 years now, we've been using some of the questions and testing some of the questions that are included in NetHope's AI Suitability Toolkit. So you saw Dinar present this specific use case through the lens of these 8 questions. If you're interested in the full toolkit, Seth will be sharing the link with you, and the framework actually includes 32 questions to help you determine suitability of AI for humanitarian and international development programs, and also to plan for sustainability. So we've sort of selected 8 out of 32 questions that are available to all of you. So now going to the next slide. So today you heard about one of the use cases and also one of the NGOs that is implementing this combination of satellite imagery and AI or AI assisted mapping. What we'd like to hear from you, and do share that in the chat window throughout the Q&A, what are some of the other use cases and topics that you would like to either hear about, to learn about, or if you have specific use cases in the humanitarian nonprofit conservation context that you'd like to share in the future webinars. So let us know in the chat window, and you can also follow up with me via email. Now, next slide. So we wanted to come back to 2 topics that Dinar highlighted in the presentation that are critical to impactful and responsible design and use of such solutions. And one is related to ethics and responsible design and use. And the other topic is related to cross-sector partnerships, because as both Dinar and Bill noted, partnering with whether it's technology companies, academia, those partnerships are critical to NGOs actually getting started and sustaining some of these projects and programs. So, Bo, I'm going to actually start with you, since Dina already talked about some of the risks that are specific to the Indonesia example, and for example, related to data like freshness and quality of data. What are you seeing across the HOT projects globally in terms of what might be some of the ethical risks related to using satellite imagery and AI in humanitarian contexts? And how are you mitigating them, including what might be the role of partners like Facebook or Microsoft in ethical design and use?
Yeah, thanks, Leila. A really good question. And actually, I think much of the answer to that question was probably Dina talked about there in different ways. So I'm just going to highlight bits from Dina's presentation then that I think really speak to this. The first and most obvious one is something that exists, I mean, whenever you're working with satellite imagery. And for me, I don't have an answer to this part of the question, so I'm apologizing, but I'm posing it as something for everybody to continually think about, in the sense is like that spectrum between like privacy and openness or transparency. And this is something that I think that is probably one of the biggest ethical risks that we face when we're working with satellite imagery, is that as an open, like for HOT, we're very focused on free and open source software. All of our products are, all of our models are. The imagery isn't always, as Dina mentioned there. And so I think that this is something that is an ethical risk of, and it all boils down for me to the point of agency, is that if you're using imagery to map someone's community and you haven't gone to that community to do that, that is a significant risk. And what we saw Dina talking about, and a lot around that quality assurance, was the interaction with the communities and the work with the communities that will be mapped or that will be working in, to make sure that the agency and the power and the rights of that data stay with the people who are going to be most directly affected. And it is one of the challenges with like something like OpenStreetMap, and those that have worked on Wikipedia before as well, knowing that you can contribute to that map by looking at a piece of imagery and mapping that. But if I'm sitting in Europe and someone else is sitting in Indonesia and I map that, that is a big power move, and something like that goes back to lots of discussions around like colonization of development, etc. So it's something that I think is a real ethical risk here. How we're mitigating these, Dina hit this perfectly. Like, and it's something that I've learned a lot over the last year, is working like so closely, like not even working with communities, but being the community. And most of the members that work on at the local levels that Dina's working at will be members of the OpenStreetMap community before they even join HOT, or we work with other members of the OpenStreetMap community separate to the organizational work that we do. So I think the key ethical risk is like understanding people's rights around data and the power that's held there. And then also how we mitigate them is not coming in and saying like, this is how we're going to do it, but starting with like the community and how they want to do it for themselves.
Thank you, Bo. Thanks for emphasizing also the importance of both human in the loop and the role of the community in framing the problem and the design, but also the validation that needs to happen on the ground. Dina, wondering if you wanted to add anything else, or if we wanted to talk about the partnerships at this point.
Thank you, Leila. This is a good question. And Facebook playing a support role for this project, and HOT is in the driver's seat. It's mean they don't control what HOT does with local knowledge. They support with tools and technical expertise. Also, they are very responsive to OSM community feedback and give them a good response. I think that's Leila.
Great, thanks, Dina. It's interesting that you're highlighting kind of the responsiveness to the OSM community feedback, as I remember reading some of the feedback in the community forum in another country. So it's great to hear that that's one of the key elements to a successful cross-sector partnership. Bo, wondering if you have any other kind of key elements or enablers of a successful cross-sector partnership that you'd like to add, and both in terms of working with technology companies, but also academia, as I know you've been, I think, working with the University of Heidelberg too.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this, probably more than we've got time for, but I think one of the things that I really recognize working at HOT that has been quite successful in relationships with cross-sector partners is finding like that common ground and finding what kind of keeps driving that partnership forward. So like first recognizing that, you know, the private sector partner has goals that they're looking to achieve and HOT has goals that we're looking to achieve, and they're not all, like all of those goals aren't aligned, but finding the ones that are and then working together with that, I think is a really important part of those successful relationships. I also think Dina touched on a really good point here about taking the leadership as well. That when, like in the past, I think, and I would say a lot of private sector partners have really grown in this sense, like since when I started working in this space. In the past, it used to be like, we have all the technical stuff and like, here's how you should do it. But as we see with HOT and what Dina was just talking about, is it's really taking the lead from the communities in how they want to do the mapping, and then recognizing that the tools are tools. There are ways to support and enhance and amplify the work that's being done. So I think that's a really, a really important part as well, is that understanding the support role, like standing beside and behind rather than standing in front.
Thanks, Bo, for highlighting some of the key components of a productive and a successful partnership, and obviously invite this community to also share what might be some of the challenges in partnering cross-sector, and what are some of the components of setting up these partnerships in a way that helps you get started, gets you the right resources, but also helps you sustain these projects. I'm going to switch to a couple of questions that are coming in from the participants, and thank you all for staying very much engaged and sharing just both the examples, but also some of the questions that you have for Bo and Dinar. There's a set of questions that is I would group in this kind of context or category of mapping in rural areas. So I'll read a few questions that have come in from Dragan, Loroma, and Narendra. And maybe both starting with you, you can talk about some of the work that you've done in Africa, and then also Dinar, if you have any thoughts to add. So the questions include, can AI imagery be used to map humanitarian relief sites in rural areas in Africa? Another question related to Africa, did you test it on jungle roads in rural Africa? And a question, I believe from Narendra, how can we create building footprint in rural areas, and which image is best for rural areas? He's looking to create building footprint in Uttar Pradesh state of India. So Bo, first to you, and then Dinar, any thoughts that you'd like to add from the work that you're doing in Indonesia?
Yeah, good questions. I'm going to not remember all of those once I get going, so I might need to be prompted along the way. In terms of the mapping of, like, sorry, can you just remind me the first one there, Layla? I was kind of formulating all my answers while I was listening to them.
Can AI imagery? Sure. Can AI imagery be used to map humanitarian relief sites in rural areas in Africa?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's right. I was connecting those first two. So yeah, in short, like there is the possibility to be able to do these things. The one thing that I really was like a hard learning for me is like probably my like, you know, outdated approach is like, oh, well, if we develop this model that works like quite successfully in somewhere like San Francisco, then of course it can be scaled because it can just be applied to this other area in like Uganda or somewhere like that where we're doing projects as well. What I definitely know to be true is that like models can be adapted, and the good thing about OpenStreetMap is there's so much data going into it that they can be trained quite successfully. However, there's quite a lot of work that goes into that to retrain models or readapt them for new contexts, because I mean, it's not a far leap to realize that like what a road and a jungle and a house looks like in Thailand might be drastically different to what a road and a house and a jungle looks like in Uganda, for example. So Yeah, there is the possibility to do that, but it definitely takes, again, I'm going to bang on about this probably throughout the whole thing, about like working with the communities to help train those models and validate those models. And I would say, like I've kind of said it this way before, but like to keep those models honest, because it's just not the same without the attention to that detail, and making sure that the community determines like, this is what a house looks like. The other thing I'll also just note is like some of the limitations of the models is like, being able to identify that there is a road there is very different from being able to identify what kind of road that is. And that's pretty critical, because if a model shows that a road exists, and particularly in humanitarian response, but it's mislabeled that road, it can be like almost worse than the road not existing. So actually we have a good example from in our team. One of our team members is a first responder, and he in fire, and he often says like, well, if something's been mapped and it's mislabeled, I'll drive a truck onto a like single track road, and that stops the whole process. So I think that's probably a really good example of like, yes, it can show that there's a road, but that's the very first level, like level 0 of what would need to be done to make that data usable. The third question was about UP, I think, and settlements. Was it informal settlements? Is that what?
Creating building footprint in rural areas, yes, in UP State.
Yeah, so I think this goes back, I don't need to talk too much more about this, but I think this goes back to my original comment about the training of models. Is like, there's the ability to adapt models, and going back to our partners too, like we have great partnerships, and there's a lot of partners out there that are willing to work on this, where the model might exist, they've probably used it for something else, and then being able to adapt that and train that to a new location is really beneficial, so that you don't have to start from scratch every time, and also leveraging the kind of expertise of the partner here too.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Bo, for reflecting on several questions at once. Dinar, any other thoughts related to the mapping in rural areas, in addition to what Bo had just shared?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I don't have many ads, because the first and the third question already explained by Bo more detail, and I don't have experience to prepare AI data from algorithm or zero. But maybe I can add for second question. Have you tried to mapping jungle rural area in Africa? Not directly, but I have a team from Tanzania that also using AI data to mapping their building and their road. Yeah, they are currently mapping in several cities, and so far still good for using this AI data for their mapping. I think that's from me, Leila.
Great, Dinar, thanks for mentioning that example in Tanzania. So for those of you who are interested in learning more about HOT's work around the globe, check out the website. Seth has already shared it in the chat window. Also, those of you, just a quick note here. Thank you for sharing some of the use cases that you're either exploring or implementing. If you are implementing some of these use cases, would love to follow up with you and see if we can share this either in the context of the AI working group that meets on a monthly basis, or in the webinar context. So please send me an email, Seth. If you could reshare my email, that would be great. There was actually a question that came in just more recently that I thought Dinar or Bo could comment on. It's related to actually what is the connectivity requirement for AI imagery, and can this be done offline?
Dina, I'm going to defer to you on that. If you've got an immediate answer, and I can support.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, for this working, yeah, connectivity is need to generate AI data and then to load imagery both in Rapid Editor and JOSM. But JOSM is more connectivity friendly rather than Rapid, because we already making a comparison between connectivity when using Rapid and JOSM. So that's why the plugin is created for connectivity friendly. That's from me, Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Dina. Not really anything to add other than those who haven't used the editors before. I mean, the first thing that is most obvious is that ID editor will is web-based, and so you do need like a pretty strong connection, especially if you're moving around across lots of different geographies where you're pulling those tiles of the imagery down all the time. And I can tell you from our technology perspective, we run a project, open source project called Tasking Manager, which some of you may have used before, and it's constantly pulling on the API to bring that data down, to bring the imagery down, as well as the OpenStreetMap data. So that's a little bit heavier, but like Dina was saying, there are tools like JOSM and using Map with AI where you can download the data and then kind of leave that data there and work with it. Or you can actually import that data from other sources as well, so that you can work across that. I will just note that both of those are desktop-based predominantly, so that also plays a role in it too.
Yeah, and Bo and Dina, just related to data, there was another question just asking about whether this is real-time data or if there is any time lapse, and how the satellite images can support in disaster events, for example.
Yeah, I'm going to take that one, Dina, if it's okay, because it's something that we like have ongoing conversations about. This is the most fascinating part for those that who are like new. I noticed on the poll, like there's some people who are just exploring this that you don't really think about, but like in essence, the concept is quite simple. Like you need good data to get good outputs or results from any kind of AI or ML work that you're doing. And if you have satellite imagery from like 5 years ago, or even 10 years ago in some cases, then that's essentially the equivalent of putting low quality data into your model. So the satellite imagery is definitely not real time. And one of the things that you might look at differently from now on, which like, if you haven't worked with this before, it might be new to you. When you look at the copyright on imagery, you'll get a copyright of not necessarily the date that imagery was taken. And so you could be looking at something that says copyright 2021, but actually the photo was taken in 2017. And this is pretty significant, especially for areas that are growing quite considerably. Now, the actual OSM data, that is real time in so much as once you submit to OpenStreetMap an edit through one of these editors, it is live real time, just like on Wikipedia. So that data that is often used to like validate and train models is current. However, this is a really weird relationship that I'm not sure if I'm going to clarify, but I could map off imagery today in 2021, but the imagery is 2017. So there's this like philosophical question about, am I mapping today or am I mapping in 2017? So that's just a thought experiment to leave everybody with.
Thanks, Bo. Dinar, anything else that you might want to add for Indonesia specifically related to real-time data or time lapse?
Yeah, for real-time data, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, for AI data from Facebook, it is not real time, which means Facebook generate one time to apply in our work. So if the satellite imagery update, for example, this month, we can not simply to adjust using AI. So that's why we need to tracing manually. But as far as I know, the major update, it will not happen unless there is a big disaster event or big changes. And also how the satellite can support for disaster event from Indonesia team. We are expansion to mapping in Palu earthquake in Sulawesi about 2 years ago, maybe. Maxar will provide the news satellite imagery, and then we map together to complete the data to support groundwork. And also last year we also support to mapping Beirut explosion from satellite imagery from Maxar to provide. I think that's ending from me, Laina.
Thank you, Dinar. And also those of you who are asking some of these questions and getting responses, feel free to follow up with Bo and Dinar if you have any additional questions you'd like to ask. And we're going to get to probably 2 more questions before we have to wrap up. So one other question, which I think is important as we think about why are we doing this? We're doing this in order to connect people on the ground to specific services and resources, whether it's healthcare, education, economic opportunities. So there's a question from a participant related to really any examples that you might be able to share of projects that you have developed or collaborated with other organizations using your maps, either Bo or Dinar.
Yeah, Dina, do you want to lead with any partnerships, like local partnership and organizations that you might have in Indonesia, and then I can talk about from the global side?
For this context, so far we also partnering with National Disaster Agency and Indonesia Red Cross, because we already complete most of Road Indonesia. That's very useful for support their work on the ground. Yeah, so far mostly used for disaster response. That's it.
Yeah, thanks, Dina. And yeah, the Red Cross is a good example that Dina is using there too, because we have a partnership in many of the countries that we work in with Red Cross as well, as well as at the global level. The thing that I'd probably note, like as a general response to that question, is that like OpenStreetMap data can be used by anybody, and we often do and don't know who's using it, which is very hard to track when you're trying to show who's using your data. But what that means is that a lot of people may either not have been exposed to it before and not realize the value that it might contribute to their organization, or they may use it but not be contributors. And why that's kind of important here is that I think like a lot of our partnerships is might be with like the with Red Cross, it might be with MSF and other like large humanitarian response organizations like that. There are definitely parts of those organizations that do contributions and mapping, and I think that's really important to note that everyone contributes to this map, but often HUT will play the role of like data provider through a portal by the name of HDX, Humanitarian Data Exchange, which some people might already know of, and also through tools such as the export tool that allows people to just go pull that data immediately for the area that they need, and that will export what was ever in OpenStreetMap that might be useful to that response. So yeah, we have many partners. We're also hoping to have many more, and see our role as the ability to provide like really community level data to the international space.
Great, thank you both. Actually, in order to end this webinar on time, I'm going to wrap up now. But what I'd like to just make sure that you know, now that you see that also the emails on the screen, is that you can follow up directly with Bo and Dinar with any questions that we might not have gotten to during this webinar. And I hope you'll stay involved and also connect with HOT about potential partnerships on the ground. I'd like to thank Dinar and Bo for fantastic presentations, for sharing their work both locally in Indonesia and also globally, and for approaching this subject not only from the perspective of technology tools, but really what problem are we trying to solve, what's the most responsible and ethical way to do this, and what's the role of partnerships in helping NGOs solve some of these problems using satellite imagery and AI. Thank you all also very much for your questions, and I look forward to the follow-up on some of the use cases that you've shared in the chat window. With that, Madeline, over to you.
Thank you, Layla, and thank you to Bo and Dinar for a really informative session today. Thanks to all of you attendees as well. We really appreciate you taking the time to attend in person during the live session. And we would like to remind you to please take a moment to complete our webinar satisfaction poll. Your feedback is very important, so just take a couple of minutes to do that. The link will be posted in the chat, and a window will pop up after you close out of Zoom. Also, do look for a follow-up email with a little summary of today's session, links to the recording and other details from today's session. You can share that broadly with your colleagues. And that is all for today. My name is Madeline No. I'm with NetHope, and we wish you a great rest of your day. Thank you.